Now the nerves kick in. Sorry, I'm just putting the stopwatch on because I have a habit of taking it right to the limit. Hello, White Waratah, Narui Burudi. This is a saying passed on to me by my father. And quite simply it means to know or to see tomorrow, we must first know yesterday. It seems like a simple statement, but it is not. It is not a dichotomy of the past and the future. They are not separate entities. They are related. They are linked. And we are the link between the two. We ensure that there's a continuity between the past, the present, and the future. And that is our role as Aboriginal Australians and as scholars. It also, for me, captures the meaning of what is an acknowledgement to country. And that is a recognition of our immense history that we can draw from and draw strength from. There's also a recognition of our future. Daro Nagun Yuwingowa. Guwu Dia, Guwu O, Guwu Ba, Bunadi Duguwa. Galamban Gadigu Oyora, Nalawa Onya, Bunadi Duguwa. Niini Bulima Nandirita. Roughly translated, the language that my grandmothers passed on to me. I wish to give my respect to elders past, present and future. And I wish to give my respect to the custodians of these lands, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And may we all see the beauty of this earth. I wish to thank Lynn very much for her acknowledgement. It was exceptionally powerful and it rang true. Not for me, because I have a certain level of, I guess, privilege. I'm not talking loud enough, so let's see. How about I try this thing? This is apparently really loud. Is that better? There we go. Okay. As long as there's no karaoke about, I can't sing for the life of me. I just wish to thank Ling for her words and sharing her uncle's experiences, because it's something that my mother went through as well. One of her early childhood experiences was going to school one day and taking up Spanish. And she was very proud because her parents had taught her Spanish. Yet when she went to the classroom, and this was in primary school, it was not a language she recognised. And she went off her head, as my mum usually does. And what she thought was Spanish was actually Dharawal, the language taught to her by her mum and her great-grandmother, a language taught in secret. Up here, you have my mother and my father. And for me, it's a privilege and honour to have them both as Dharawal. My mother identifies as Bidikul, the Bidawater peoples, the grandmother's people, she likes to call it. And my father is further inland. He's Nada Madigal, freshwater peoples. I'm very proud of them both. On your left, the photo of my mum is her holding up a placard. I'm not sure if you can see it. And it's to have Aboriginal knowledge as recognised as a science. It's something she is very passionate about. She's always been very passionate about it, whether it be the medicinal knowledges that have been passed on to her, whether it be the climate knowledges. And it's something in its work I'm very proud of. You can go. Oh, keep going? Okay. My father has a slightly different story. He did not find out he was Aboriginal until his late teens, well before I was born. And how he found out was quite tragic. He remembered the stories his dad passed on to him. He remembered his dad reading books to him as he went to sleep when he was a child. And when he was 15, his father passed away. And one day, when he was finally moving out of home, he found these books. But when he opened the pages, he did not recognize the stories at all. He went to his mother and asked her, and she broke down in tears. His mother was non-Indigenous. His father was Dharawal. My dad never knew that until his father died. And here we have the next generation. This is a photo I am very proud of because it has my daughter. Now, if we go by custom, my daughter should have been named Elvie Perry after my grandmother. But we recognise that Elvie and Perry are not Indigenous names. They're not Dharawal names. And so the custom, I guess, had already been broken by colonisation. And so we've named it Talara after one of our law stories, one of our learning stories. Talara Tini, the story of the flannel flower, a story of hope and a story of respecting our children. Before I go any further though, I've spoken of who I am. I was born a Dharawal person thanks to both my parents, the courage of my parents. I've always been Dharawal and I've never known otherwise. At the same time, I guess, in today's politics, there's a bit of what you'd call an elephant in the room. And that is what you see before you. What you see in both my parents. For me, it's my pale skin. It's my angular features. It's what I call the mask of white privilege. The mask of white male privilege. This means I could walk down the street and not worry about being harassed by police. This means I could catch a train late at night and not fear for my safety, not worry about media reports of how I dress. This means I could get off at a particular station and not worry if there are only stairs. But this is a mask. It is not who I am. I like to think as much as possible. My eyes are open and my heart is open. And I know I am Dharawal. As I was preparing for this presentation, two intriguing articles appeared in the news media over the weekend. And they were by two very strong Aboriginal women who, if we think of it in Western standards, are at opposite ends of Western ideologies. There's an article in the Australian by Jacinta Price, someone who I don't often agree with, where she spoke of her experiences as a Warlpiri woman. I won't engage with this article yet, but I will a little bit later. The article that really struck me, though, was by Chelsea Bond. Beware this black man in a tailored suit and tie. Unbeknownst to him, he screams to the world, I am more man than black. These are the direct words of Chelsea. This tailored suit is all that he possesses. It's not an armour with which he can fight colonisation. but rather it is an appeal to the oppressor. Like me, if he is lucky, he's already acquired a white wife. There is a violence in his incompetence and brutality in his everydayedness, one which must be understood. He is the one who will be appointed to the position of power in black affairs, often without qualification. Such is the power of that tailing. Such is the power of the tailored suit and tie. I messaged Chelsea over the weekend and asked for permission to engage with this piece. And she was very open. And she said there is no way she'll stop anyone engaging with her work that's printed in public. I explained to her how I wanted to engage with this, and she was happy. She was very respectful, and I appreciate that. I want you to keep these words in mind for now, and I'll revisit Chelsea's paper at the end of this presentation. But if you haven't read it already, I strongly encourage you to. I'm talking today about storytelling. Gawaian Waratah, our ancestral stories, our law stories, what is more commonly known as our dreaming stories. My mother argues, I read a piece recently, and actually Jacinta argued this in her paper, and she said the only resource we as Aboriginal people had was food. And that's all we had. And so we shared it. She's correct in our sharing, but it was not our only resource. And my mother argues there is truly only one resource that can be traded, shared, or given away and still remain the responsibility and in the possession of the owner. And that is our knowledges, our Aboriginal knowledges, our stories, our learnings, our standpoints. And our stories were our key to learning. Our stories are our key to learning. And within the Dharawal context, our stories represented and taught us of our relatedness to country, to our ancestral spirits, to each other, to our laws, our past, our present, our future. I argue, most importantly, our stories teach us about ourselves. What I've been taught is that each and every learning story or law story has 3 layers of meaning. There is a 3rd layer. If you were to hear a Dharawal story, if you were to hear it on country, country will be included in the story. You'll be taught how to respect country, how to live off country as the story is being told. The 2nd layer is the lore of the story, and this is never shared straight away. This is something you must discover, something you must talk about with the storyteller and your elders. Sometimes it comes very quickly. Sometimes it takes a long time to learn. And then there's a 1st layer of meaning in our stories, and that is only shared by the most senior of knowledge holders and elders, and more often than not cannot be spoken about. Now I'll confess here and now, there's only a small number of stories where I know of the 1st layer. I have much to learn. And so I'm going to share briefly a story with you today. I ask you to please understand that this story is not told in a proper context. This story belongs around the Thelmia Lakes, as we call it today. It's where this story's place is. I'm in a lecture theatre, and whilst country will always be here, I cannot engage with country as we should when telling this story. So please understand that this is a poor imitation of how it should be done. Regardless, I'm sharing with you the story of Pokelby, of how the plant known as a Dianella came to be. And you see, Pokelby was recognised as one of the most beautiful women to have ever existed. There was an aura, a strength, a courage about her. But as I said, she was beautiful. There was a uniqueness to this beauty as well, because she had the darkest eyes, blacker than black, eyes that were so black that when the sun shone on them just at that right way, they shone blue. This had never been seen before. And this took the breath away of many, many young men. But this story doesn't start when Pokelby was a woman. It starts when she was a child, when she was cared for by her loving mother. She was cared for by her loving uncle. She was raised properly. She was raised with respect, both her and her sisters. Pokelby's uncle had a very good friend by the name of Kalara. Kalara was a great hunter and a great warrior. He was very much respected, not only by Pokelby's family, but by the clan and the surrounding clans and nations. And one day, Pokelby's uncle died. He fell from a cliff and never returned. This upset not only Pokelby, but the whole family. Her mother was distraught, but she was also worried. But no longer they had someone to hunt for them. She was worried for her children. But Kalara took on these duties. He showed his honour, he showed his ability to care, and he watched over and he helped Pokelby, her mother and her sisters survive. He helped them stay healthy and stay strong. And Pokelby's mother appreciated this. She held much respect for Kalara. And so one day she approached Kalara and she said, I have a kinship debt to you. What can I do for you? How can I repay this debt? And Kalara simply said, when Pokelby comes of age, I'd like her to be my wife. The mother agreed. She was very happy to agree. She knew who Kalara was and she trusted him, and she had every right to trust him, as did Pokelby. This works. Can I try this? Because then I can walk around. Yeah. Can you hear me okay with this? No? Okay. Ah, that would help. Thank you. Can you hear me okay with this? Pardon the scratching. All right. All right, I can't move too much. I usually like to walk around and, yeah, okay, so I'll keep very still. All right, where was I? Okay, yes, soon after, Kalara was called to war. A clan, an ally from a long way away, was in a lot of trouble, and they desperately needed help. And Kalara showed his honour, and he travelled this distance. And without question, he gave himself to our friends and our allies. Unfortunately, this was the Great War, one that lasted a long time, one in which he became gravely injured. But he survived. But as he was healing, as he was weak, an evil spirit infected him. An evil spirit corrupted him. And Polkabi's mother heard of the great exploits Kalara had done. But then the stories of him after he was injured changed. He turned into a very, very cruel man, a vicious man that not only showed little mercy, but thrived in the pain of others. And Polkabi's mother began to feel fear, immense fear for her daughter, because he could return and demand Polkabi as his wife. She hoped, though, that he wouldn't. And Polkabi came of age, and he had yet to return. And she started to breathe easily. And she started to allow other young men to court her. But then Kalara returned. And when Polkabi's mother saw him, she realized that this was not the man that she had given her daughter away to. She asked him to wait, to talk with the elders. But that very night, he stole her away. He used his immense strength, and he dragged her from the camp. And he dragged her many days and many nights at a pace that caused Polkabi much pain, until eventually they reached the campsite, the place that Kalara had prepared earlier, a place that he knew no one would ever find. And Polkabi was upset. She was in tears. She was in pain. She knew she would never see her mother and her sisters, her family, her cousins ever again. And she became immensely depressed. She almost lost the will to live, until one day, as she was being forced to serve Kalara, she was gathering berries until she saw these tiny little birds. They had no colour, but they were shy and they were scared, and they were hiding in these thorny bushes. And so some of the berries she had picked earlier, she left for them and returned to the campsite. The next time she returned to this area, though, the birds were not as shy. They came out to greet her. And suddenly, Polkabi found a new family. These beautiful little birds that flew around her, that sung for her, that were with her during her suffering. Over time, though, her grief lessened. She had her new family. She still had to deal with Kalara, but she was becoming happier. And suddenly Kalara realized this. He saw this happiness in Polkabi, and he became suspicious. He became worried. He thought something was happening, something out of his control. And so one day, when he was going off to hunt, rather than hunt, he hid. And he waited for Polkabi to leave the camp. And he followed her all the way to these thorny bushes. And he saw these birds. And he saw how happy she was. And he became very angry. How dare someone else give her happiness? How dare something else give her happiness? And so he stormed down towards Polkabi. He grabbed one of the birds and he crushed it within his hands. And he warned Polkabi that she was never to return to this site again. If she did, he would kill the remaining birds, and then he would travel back and kill her mother and family. Once again, Polkabi fell into a deep depression. Every night she cried herself to sleep. But over time, the birds returned. They were very careful, but they came to her rather than her going to them. And she was very happy, for whenever she foraged, whenever she found the berries, they were there with her, keeping her company. Yet whenever she returned back to camp, she pretended to cry. That was her way of making Kalara happy. And as time drew on, Kalara grew old. His beard became grey. He struggled with his strength. But Polkabi remained strong. Her beauty seemed to grow with the happiness the birds, her new family, had given her. And Kalara started to notice this, and again he became suspicious. So again one day, he hid. And he followed Polkabi. He spied on her as much as he could, but she never returned to the thorny bush he told her not to go to. He decided to go to this bush anyway, and when he tore it apart, there were no birds there. He was perplexed. He went back to the campsite and saw Polkabi grinding some seeds. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him and smiled. He did not know why she smiled, and this made him very angry. And so he struck her as hard as he could, with all the anger, the bitterness he had. And as she fell to the ground, she hit her head on a stone. As she hit her head, the birds flew out from her hair. That was where they were hiding. They saw Kalara and they hid up in the trees as fast as possible. And Kalara saw this and he felt betrayed. He had not followed his orders. And so he kicked her. He struck her again and again and again. The birds saw this. And they attacked. They were tiny, but they were many. And they struck him as fast and as hard as possible. They struck at his eyes. Their beaks punctured his skin. And Kalara was shocked. He did not know how to fight this. And he was defeated by these tiny little birds, who themselves were now grieving, for Polkabi had died. As Kalara fell to the ground and his blood soaked into the earth, the evil spirit left him. It fled from a body that would soon also be lifeless. And he reached across and he took Polkabi's hand. And he felt the grief he had given her. But he also felt the love he had never been able to show. The birds saw this. And so they covered both their bodies with leaves to return them to the earth. And when they saw this happen, they were shocked. Because out from these leaves sprung a beautiful long leaf plant. And what grew from it were these stunning blue flowers that gave way to these bright blue berries. The plant we know now as a dianella. The plant the Dharawal call pokelby. Next to the dianella, though, another plant grew. A plant that we have no name for, but it's known commonly as the old man's whisker, and is often found near the dianella. The male birds, though, still felt grief. They had lost pokelby, and in part they also felt responsible. And so they took the blueberries, they crushed them, and they placed them on their wings, so they would always know to look after their loved ones. And they became known today as the Blue Wren. That is the story of pokelby. It is not a pleasant story. It is not a happy story, and our stories aren't usually happy. I'm going to hold off on exploring the layers of meaning in this story. But as I talk through this presentation, I want you to think about what could be learnt from this story. These sharing of stories within academic context is not something new. The pioneers in this area, or Indigenous and First Nations scholars who are found very influential, are Joanne Archibald and Karen Martin. Joanne Archibald's book is absolutely amazing. If you have not read it, I strongly advise you do. Within this book, she relates to a number of principles and working with Indigenous and First Nations stories. She speaks of respect, where we must respect the country from which the stories come from, the cultures that may be attached to them, the custodians and the storytellers themselves. We have a responsibility when stories are being shared. We must listen and listen deeply. We must seek to learn from these stories. And when we think we have answers, we must share these with our storytellers and our elders. And if our answers capture the truth of these stories, or the truths, we must first seek permission before we can share them ourselves. It then becomes our responsibility to protect and share these stories, to ensure that they stay alive. But in sharing these stories, we must treat them with reverence. They cannot be reduced solely to something that can be written on a page. We must know how to tell these stories properly. We must always defer to our knowledge holders in the oral histories and the processes behind maintaining these stories. We must respect the holism behind story work. We need to realize that these stories are not only connected to our intellect, they have physical implications, emotional implications, and spiritual implications. They connect us, they relate us to ourselves, to our community, to our nation. And this interrelatedness moves beyond mere memorization. We must live the story. The story must remain with us, and we must continually learn from the stories that we are taught. They are not something that is in the past. They are with us now, and they will guide our future. And so when we share the story, we must be aware of the vast complexities within these stories, the contextual specifics, the importance of telling the story, the importance of listening to the story and listening to the learners of the stories. Karen Martin's work, Please Knock Before You Enter, is exceptionally powerful, and she uses story work as part of her Quandamuka methodology. And she speaks to the notion of relatedness. And this notion of relatedness, to me, very strongly reveals how deeply our stories are embedded into everything about us. Our responsibilities, our duties to not only ourselves and our family, but our country, our peoples, our survival. There are a number of papers, many more than this, that have engaged with our traditional stories, our ancestral stories, our dreaming stories, both within Australian and international contexts. I don't have time to go over these three papers, but I will draw your attention to Joanne Archibald's one. It's within her book, where she talks about the Coyote's search for a bone needle. I'm not going to tell the story, it's not my right, but I'll briefly summarise it, because there's a very important lesson attached to it. And that is the coyote is looking for a needle by the fire, and he cannot find it. And an owl comes along and helps him. But the owl can't find it either, even with his superior eyesight. And so the owl asks the coyote, "Where did you last have it?" And the coyote said, "Down by the river." And the owl said, "Why are you searching here?" And the coyote said, "Because that is where the light is. That is where it's easiest to search." And that is the danger of research. That is also a danger embedded within storytelling. Because we have many stories that can be easily accessed. They're referred to as Aboriginal myths and legends. And they are almost always collected by non-Indigenous people. Their context is removed. Their connections to country is removed. The peoples, the nations which they belong to or are attached to are removed. And they're put on one simple piece of paper, sometimes with pretty pictures. Beware of these stories. But remember, they are still stories and they can teach us a lesson. Just maybe not what we think. I would argue this is what Larissa Brink calls colonial storytelling, where non-Indigenous peoples have co-opted our stories, have moulded our stories into something else that appeases them, that amuses them, and more often than not is to our detriment. She highlights many examples within literature, but she also highlights very strong examples within policy and research. One example she gives is the response to the Stolen Generations report, the Bring Him Home report by the government, where they focused on only 1 in 10 Aboriginal people being affected by the stolen generations. This is colonial storytelling. This is a minimisation of our grief, of our lived experiences. It lacks a deeper understanding that the brothers and the sisters, the mothers and the fathers, the aunties and the uncles were also deeply affected by the stolen generations. Colonial storytelling minimises, simplifies who we are. And so I'm going to very briefly just go over a couple of examples where I've engaged with our ancestral stories and research. The most recent one is with a non-Indigenous scholar by the name of Neil Harrison, someone who I would call an ally, and a strong ally. Within this story, or within this paper, he speaks of what he calls sensational pedagogies, how in teaching we are too focused on memorization, on cognitive strategies and so forth. And the engagement, the emotional engagement with learning becomes sacrificed. And he argues that our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, teaching, have a much stronger engagement with these sensational pedagogies. And so, with my mum and myself, we spoke of the story of the Migadin, the mermaid of Bargo River. This is a picture of the site of the story. It doesn't do it justice. But on the far right-hand side, you can see a little blue figure. That is my mother. And maybe that will give you a little indication of the enormity of this place, the power of this place. And what we have here is a Bargo River flowing down into what's known as the Mermaid Pools, the resting place of the Migadin. I won't tell the story, but I will say that within this paper we briefly explained how when telling this story on country, it increases its power, it increases its impact as we travel from upstream down towards the Mermaid Pools, towards the place of a great war that took place, the course of the foolishness of men. A foolishness that continues. On the left-hand side are the remains of a painting of two lyrebirds, our clan totem. You might be able to see some black squiggles across it. That is graffiti. On the right-hand side is the remains of the painting of the Migadin. You can only just barely, where the rock slants down, see her 2 feet. She had the head of a fish, the body of a human. And she was a river spirit, a mother, a protector of the children of the river. And we betrayed her. And we suffered for it. This painting is a warning to stay away from the mermaid pools. They are now a popular swimming hole for non-Indigenous people. And every year, someone gets injured. About every 2 or 3 years, I'd argue the Migadin gets hungry and someone dies. Despite our warnings that have been desecrated. Another paper was the story of how the White Waratah became red. I love this story. It's a tragedy as well. Why I love this story is that within the Sydney area, I'm aware of at least 5 different ways this story has been told across the nations around the Sydney area. To me, it is a representation of our diversity. And with this paper, we engage with the laws and the meaning behind the story to critique media narratives on welcome to country ceremonies. Media stereotypes of welcome to countries only began in 1972. Which, if you read the paper, is a gross miscitation. Started by Piers Ackerman, I would argue, yet repeated by many scholars in their writings. Down the bottom is a picture of what's known as Cataract Dam. This is the location of this story. It is now underwater. We could say it's now protected. This is an extreme example of what I would call colonial storytelling. It's a paper published in 2010 called Making Tribes by Powell and Hesley. They look at the colonial archives and try to find evidence of the Aboriginal nations and clans around the Sydney region. And they come to the conclusion that they are fabrications of the colonisers themselves. They argue that the Cadigal, the Eora, the Wongal, the Darug, the Yuin don't exist. They're mistranslations, and that the Aboriginal peoples, the children, the elders, and the knowledge holders of today have adopted them based on nothing but what the white men have written about us in their ignorance hundreds of years ago. Colonial storytelling. This is the danger of colonial storytelling because it erases us. And so we come to the first paper I ever engaged with regards to our ancestral stories. There were two motivations for this paper. The first was a lot of research, a lot of stereotypes about urban Aboriginal peoples, how we've lost our culture. How, like Pow and Houseling, we have simply made up our identities. In the words of Callenshaw, we are anthropologically embarrassing. We are wannabe Aboriginals. According to Bess Price, Jacinta Price's mother, and David Price, her father, they argue the great majority of Australians who currently identify as Indigenous speak English, live in the suburbs, and produce children with Australians who do not identify as Indigenous. Just like me. Unless they have studied anthropology and linguistics, their understanding of traditional law and culture will come from half-remembered musings of aged relatives themselves several generations removed from traditional life. This paper, in part, came about in response to that, but also a community activity that I was asked to take part in with Uncle Ross Evans, a Dharawal man who has served the Campbelltown community for a long time, and he's been recognised as such. And we ran a completely free martial arts program with Dharawal storytelling as part of it. We called it a Two Cultures program, free for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal kids. It was in partnership with Macquarie Fields Police. They funded it, as in they provided the resources. For some reason, the school which it was taking part in, there was a community event that was taking place, and the land council of the area wanted a particular elder, who I have no disrespect for, to do the Welcome to Country. This was a school in an impoverished area, and they wanted to charge the elder, or charge the school $300. Now, I have no objection whatsoever to remuneration for our elders and our representatives. But Uncle Ross asked my mum to do the welcome instead. So my mum never asked for money, particularly when children are involved. The Land Council bit back. The Wiradjuri CEO announced the knowledges had been passed on to Mum, my father, and Uncle Ross, and Auntie Karen, and said that they were not recognised. And so this is where storytelling became healing for us. We wrote this story to recognise our diversities. This is a story of a monster that ravaged our lands and other nations' lands. And it was not until we could work together in all our diversity that this monster became defeated. For us, storytelling was a process of healing. The disrespect felt by my mum and Uncle Ross was there, but we at least got some strength in this paper. And we continued with the program regardless. I'm just about out of time. But here is Jacinta Price's words in The Australian this weekend. She talks about her experience as a Warlpiri woman, something I will never contest, just as I would never contest Chelsea Bond's experiences. She moves on though to take aim at those who live in urban settings, and she tries to represent us to further her point. The dialogue, often engaged by some, particularly those of more conservative ilk, is that Aboriginal culture is violent, like the Polkabi story. And there is evidence for that, a plethora of evidence. You'll see it reported in the media over and over again. You'll see it in academic narratives. But what does the research say? It's a paper by Weatherburn and Snowball. It looked at over 7,000 Aboriginal representatives within, I think, and that's the starter, and found that there was no relation between cultural attachment and experiences of violence for those in non-remote and remote settings. The biggest predictor was alcohol. More recently, a paper by Carrington Shepherd and Yin Paradies looked at the recidivism rates of Aboriginal offenders and found that one of the strongest protective factors was not cultural attachment, but cultural practices that were passed on within the jail. An attachment to culture that moved beyond mere words and feelings, but practice itself, and is protected against returning to incarcerated settings. I'll skip this, and I'll now return to Chelsea Bond's words. Beware the black man in the tailored suit. I cite this because when I first read this, I was angry, I was shocked, I was outraged, I was offended. I wear a suit and a tie, obviously. I have a white wife. But I'm aware of my thoughts. And I was able to stop. I was able to think. And at least in part, I listened to what Chelsea was trying to say. And Chelsea admitted that the black man in a tailored suit, places him in closer proximity to whiteness. But he does not threaten to destabilize whiteness. The greatest threat of this black man is the black woman, for she cannot wear the suit and she cannot envelop herself in the same armoury, get access to the same government tables so easily. But she is not speaking of all black men in suits. She's not speaking of her father's generation that wore these suits to restore a sense of dignity that had been so brutally ripped from them. She was suggesting that the black man in the suit be seen for what he is, a cautionary tale rather than an aspirational goal. After all, his betrayal is not just to black women, but to all black people. It was a cautionary tale. It was a warning. It was her story of her lived experiences. And if we listen and if we don't get caught up into some white political divide, we can learn from this story. And so returning to the Polkabi story. Here we have pictures of the Dianella. They're fruiting right now. My daughter loves them, mind you. Very beautiful. On the left-hand side is Thelmy Lakes. That was near where I grew up as a kid. I lost count of the amount of times I would ride there and I would just sit on the jetty and watch the water. There was something healing about this very still lake and the ripples of the wind caressing the water. I would become hypnotized of it. Any grief I had would disappear in the beauty. 10 years ago, the council approved longwall mining. This is the lake today. This is the location of this story. Beware the black man in the tailored suit. Beware of not listening to our stories and not understanding the consequences of our actions. Tajari Guru, thank you for listening. Uluwonga Nali Nali. Please walk in the sunlight.